At first it was just a letter, a $75 fine for planting roses. Then came the citations for unauthorized wind chimes. Next, security cameras installed across the street. My neighbors stopped talking. My dog died under suspicious circumstances. And finally, someone burned my house to the ground. But what they didn't know, what no one in the HOA realized, was that I wasn't just another retired homeowner. I was a federal judge, and I had just made their abuse a federal case. This isn't fiction. This isn't a dramatization. This is a true story of corruption, intimidation, and ultimate justice. Inside one of America's most dangerous institutions, the Homeowners Association, and it's time the country saw what happens when a bully HOA picks the wrong house. I moved to Pinterest Valley to retire quietly. A small, peaceful mountain town with wraparound porches, wildflowers in the ditches, and a place where neighbors used to wave. I bought a simple home near the edge of the development one, with an extra plot for gardening, a wraparound deck, and just enough space to breathe. My name is Samuel Barrett. I served as a federal judge for 31 years. I've presided over organized crime cases, securities fraud, and even war crimes testimonies, but nothing prepared me for the corruption I'd face in my own neighborhood. When I moved in, I wasn't Judge Barrett. I was just Sam, retired, alone, and content to finally sleep and past 6 a.m. The HOA sent me a welcome letter. It came with a rule book thicker than a state constitution and more red ink than a prosecutor's evidence list. But I didn't think much of it. After all, what's a few lawn regulations? The first violation came 2 weeks after I planted wildflowers along the stone path to my mailbox. Unapproved landscaping, $1.75 fine. I paid it. I wasn't looking for a fight. The second came days later. Unauthorized trellis, $100 fine. I had installed a wooden trellis for my climbing roses, the same kind my late wife had loved, the same pattern we'd used in our first house, decades ago. I called the HOA office. A woman named Carol answered. Her tone was clipped. Sir, you'll need to file Form 8A for any vertical garden structure. Vertical? Garden? Structure? I laughed. She didn't. Then came the warning letters, the threatening language, the notes left on my door. Someone even keyed my truck. At the monthly HOA meeting, I introduced myself politely, but the room went silent when I said I had legal training. A few board members glanced at each other. One of them, Trisha, gave me a smirk I'll never forget. That smirk said everything. She didn't see a neighbor. She saw a threat. Over the next 90 days, my property was cited 14 times. Garden flags, exterior light bulbs, even my recycling bin, visible from the street. I began documenting everything, dates, times, witnesses. I knew the law, and I knew they were walking a thin line between civil enforcement and criminal harassment. What I didn't expect was how quickly my neighbors fell silent. One by one, people who had once waved at me now looked away. I learned later that Trisha had warned them. Don't get involved with Sam. He's litigious. I never threatened a lawsuit. I never raised my voice, but the intimidation escalated. Someone poisoned my dog. She was just 6 years old. No one claimed to see anything. Security footage from the HOAS street cameras accidentally deleted. That was when I started preparing my case. Not as a homeowner, but as a federal officer of the court. They didn't know who I was. Not really, and I was going to keep it that way. For now, I wasn't just documenting a hostile HOA. I was collecting evidence of a pattern of targeted retaliation, financial misconduct, and civil rights violations. And I wasn't alone. Across the country, thousands of families were being harassed, fined, and threatened by HOAs operating without oversight. They seized homes, intimidated veterans, and bankrupted retirees, all under the guise of community standards. But Pinterest Valley, it was about to become ground zero. The night they burned my house down, they made a fatal error, and they turned a retired judge into their worst nightmare. The letter was folded once, printed on thick cream paper with the HOAS logo, a minimalist mountain and pine tree. It almost looked like a wedding invitation, but inside was a different kind of announcement. You are in violation of Covenant 1 to a non-conforming decorative landscaping. Fine assessed, $75. Deadline for payment, 10 business days. No warning, no photo, no explanation. I walked outside and stared at the flowers I'd planted along my walkway. They were native wildflowers, drought-resistant, pollinator-friendly, and nowhere near the property line. A quiet memorial to my wife, who loved natural gardens and hated perfectly trimmed hedges. Still, I paid the fine. I figured it was easier than arguing. Maybe they were strict, maybe they had a process. I didn't want to start trouble, not in the first month, but that was their first test, and I failed it. 3 days later, I received a second notice. This time, unauthorized structure, trellis, installed without prior approval. Fine, $100. They included a grainy photo, a close-up of the wooden arch over my side gate. I had built it myself, just like I did in every home I ever owned. This one was simple, modest, but apparently, it violated some clause buried on page 38 of the HOA guidelines. Something about vertical constructs not harmonizing with community aesthetic. It became clear. This wasn't about flowers or this was about control, and they thought I'd be easy. The violations kept coming. Overhead lighting that wasn't neutral, toned. A hanging bird feeder labeled pest-attracting decor. A porch chair not approved in the HOAS furniture palette. I kept a folder. Each letter went inside, chronologically organized. I marked dates, recorded conversations, printed emails, and I started to ask questions. At the next HOA meeting, I sat quietly through 40 minutes of discussion about mailbox paint and approved mulch types. Then, I raised my hand. Could someone point me to the appeals process for citations? The room went still. Trisha Madsen, HOA president, real estate broker, and self-declared community vision keeper, looked up from her iPad. Her voice was smooth and flat. There is no formal appeals process, so if you disagree with a citation, you can request clarification. But fines are final. I nodded. And what oversight exists for board decisions? Is there a vote? Any input from non-board members? Trisha smiled without warmth. All actions are guided by the bylaws, which you agreed to upon closing. If you'd like to volunteer, we do have a beautification subcommittee with one open slot. Beautification. Right after the meeting, a board member named Nathan pulled me aside. Off the record, he said, you might want to let the landscaping stuff go. Trish has her eye on your property. I raised an eyebrow. My property. He looked uncomfortable. She's been saying you're not a good fit, that you're uncooperative, that your modifications lower the property values. I looked around the development. Cookie-cutter houses with artificial lawns and pressure-washed fences. My roses were the only thing with color. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rules. It was about control and optics. Trisha ran this neighborhood like it was her private HOA. The next week, a contractor entered my backyard unannounced. He said he was checking fence alignment for the HOA. I asked who authorized him. He didn't answer. I called the sheriff. They said it was a civil matter, so I installed cameras, front and back. 3 days later, I got another citation. Security equipment visible from public walkway? Fine. $125. I began researching not just my HOA, but the structure of HOAs in general. Over 74 million Americans live under HOA governance, and while many are fair, too many operate with unchecked power, limited transparency, and virtually no state oversight. Some HOAs control not just aesthetics but behavior, dictating political signs, religious symbols, even the color of curtains. I reached out to neighbors, quietly, privately, and knocked on doors, brought coffee, listened. What I found was chilling. An elderly couple had been fined over $900 for planting tomatoes in a side yard. They paid, then had to sell their home to cover the liens. A young family said their children weren't allowed to draw chalk art on their own driveway. Non-permanent markings in public view, the citation read. One man told me his HOA dues had tripled in 5 years, and that he'd never seen a single budget. It was a pattern? Silence? Intimidation? Financial coercion? The final straw came on a Wednesday morning. I opened my mailbox and found a notice of non-compliance escalation. It said that due to unpaid fines, some of which I had already disputed, the HOA would begin lien proceedings against my property. Let that sink in. They were threatening to take my house because of roses and wind chimes and a trellis. That day, I took off the gloves. I filed formal record requests under Colorado's HOA transparency law. I demanded copies of all meeting minutes, budgets, contracts, and violation logs. When they refused, I petitioned the court. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every single person who had ever been bullied into submission by an unaccountable board. That's when things escalated. Someone slashed my tires. My mailbox was smashed. My rear motion light was shattered. Police said it was probably kids. But I knew better, because Trisha had made a mistake. She sent me an email, a short, flippant reply to a question I'd asked about my landscaping. She wrote, "If you can't follow the rules, maybe you should find a neighborhood more your ... style." Then, at the bottom, P.S. You're not the only one with legal training. It was subtle, almost playful, but it was the first confirmation I had that this wasn't incompetence. It was calculated. And now, I had proof. They thought they were pushing around a retiree, but they were actually poking a judge with 30 years of experience in exposing corruption. The game had changed, and the fine that sparked it all. It just lit a legal wildfire. What you just heard is a textbook example of how power can be quietly weaponized in HOA communities across the country. On paper, HOAs exist to maintain neighborhood quality and protect property values. But in practice, especially when dominated by entrenched leadership, they can become authoritarian microgovernments. Let's break this down. First, the stacking of minor citations, starting with landscaping, then the trellis, then porch furniture, isn't accidental. This is known as compliance layering. It's a pressure tactic meant to exhaust the homeowner financially and emotionally, often to drive them out or force blind conformity. Second, the lack of an appeals process is a red flag. Every fair HOA should offer a formal and transparent mechanism to challenge citations. If there's no appeals process in your governing documents, that's not just bad policy. It may be grounds for legal reform or civil litigation. And third, the use of fines as a gateway to lien threats. That's where this shifts from petty to predatory. In many states, including Colorado, HOAs have the authority to place liens for unpaid dues or fines, and in some cases, even initiate foreclosure proceedings. That's real power. And in the wrong hands, it becomes a tool of retaliation. What this case shows us is the importance of transparency, documentation, and community coalition building. This homeowner didn't just fight back. He built a paper trail, connected with neighbors, and used his legal knowledge to expose the machinery of abuse. Let this be a reminder. In an HOA dispute, silence is submission. Education and evidence are your strongest allies. The first video clip was 2:30 a.m. It showed a figure in a hoodie walking along the side of my property. The person stayed in the shadows, moved with purpose. They carried something long in one hand, a tool or crowbar, possibly. The motion sensor light flicked on, just as the figure darted behind my shed, out of view. 10 seconds later, the camera caught the same figure leaving, but this time, my rear security light had been shattered. That was the moment I stopped calling these incidents petty. They were personal. I took the footage to the sheriff's office. A deputy watched in silence, then sighed. Even with footage, unless we can ID the person or link them to a suspect, it's a dead end. No fingerprints, no license plates. I asked if they'd questioned the HOA board. He shook his head. They're not suspects. It's vandalism, not a felony, and you don't have any direct evidence. Not yet, I thought. Back home, I installed an additional set of cameras. Higher resolution, motion-triggered floodlights, and automatic cloud storage. This time I posted the devices in full view of the street. 2 days later, I received a cease and desist letter from the HOA. You are hereby notified that your recent installation of surveillance equipment constitutes visual trespass and may infringe on neighbor privacy. If these are not removed within 72 hours, further legal action will be pursued. Visual trespass? That wasn't a real thing, at least not in this context. I drafted a reply citing People v. Diaz in Colorado revised statutes 1321-123, which allows exterior home surveillance in public-facing areas. I copied the sheriff, my attorney, and 2 local journalists. The letter disappeared, but the pressure didn't. At the next board meeting, I brought printed stills from the footage. Your policies claim to protect residents, I said. But someone vandalized my property. I expect the board to publicly denounce any acts of intimidation and cooperate with the investigation. Trisha smiled like a wolf in pearls. Sir, we are not responsible for neighborhood drama. The board cannot comment on unverified allegations or private security measures, but you can threaten legal action over fake violations. She ignored the question. That night, an envelope was slid under my door. No return address. Inside, minutes from private HOA executive sessions, marked confidential, detailing enforcement actions, fine projections, and something else. A single line, highlighted in yellow, recommend escalation of non-compliant property at Lot 19. Explore code trigger strategies and force sale scenario if necessary. Lot 19 was my property. This wasn't paranoia. It was a paper trail, and someone on the inside had just handed me the match. I started building my case. First, I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. Then I filed a subpoena request for the HOAS financial records, enforcement logs, and contracts with third-party vendors, including their private security patrol, which I now suspected was doubling as a harassment arm. Next, I contacted Miranda Torres, an investigative reporter known for her coverage of HOA abuses across the state. I sent her a copy of the footage, the vandalism report, and a timeline of citations. I didn't have to convince her. I've seen this pattern before, she said. It starts with code violations. Then, nuisance citations. Then comes the lien threat. And if the homeowner doesn't fold, they weaponize foreclosure laws. We'll run it. The article ran the next Sunday. When homeownership turns hostile, one judge's battle against his age. The headline went viral. By Monday, I had 127 emails from homeowners across Colorado and over a dozen from other states. Their stories echoed mine, some even worse. A single mom in Nevada, whose HOA fined her $500 for a wheelchair. A veteran in Arizona threatened with foreclosure for installing a flagpole. A black family in Georgia fined for unapproved seasonal decor. A Kwanzaa display. This wasn't local, it was systemic. The media attention changed everything. Trisha issued a public statement calling the article grossly misleading and accusing me of manipulating the press for personal vendettas. But at the next HOA meeting, the room was full. And not just with residents. There were reporters, a state representative, and 2 attorneys. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stood and spoke. An elderly woman said she paid over $3,000 in fines for non-harmonious mailbox tint. A man in the back said he was denied approval for his home sale Because of an outdated shrub contour? Someone finally asked the question no one had dared say aloud. Where's all this fine money going? Trisha froze. She said the funds were allocated per budget guidelines and referred to the treasurer, but I had already obtained the numbers. In 5 years, the HOA had collected over $412,000 in violation fines. Less than 10% had been used for community improvements. Over 60% went to administrative costs. Much of it to Trisha's consulting firm, her husband's maintenance company, and a legal retainer billed to a shell LLC. And this ends now. Murmurs filled the room. The board called for an emergency recess. That night, the treasurer resigned. The next morning, Miranda Torres called me. "You're not just a story anymore," she said. "You're a case study." And the footage that started it all. It became evidence in a criminal investigation. What unfolded in that segment is a transition point. Not just in the story, but in the legal implications of HOA governance. This is where we move beyond nuisance citations and enter the realm of systematic abuse, civil fraud, and potential criminal misconduct. Let's begin with the cease and desist letter over security cameras. This is a common scare tactic used by aggressive HOA boards. But here's the truth. Most states, including Colorado, permit exterior surveillance. If it is confined to your own property in public-facing areas, attempting to prohibit it without a clear, legally binding covenant is not only unenforceable, it can open the HOA to liability. The real bombshell here is the internal HOA document referencing code trigger strategies and forced sale scenarios. That language is chilling. It suggests premeditated targeting of specific homeowners, which, if proven in court, can constitute civil conspiracy, harassment, and even racketeering under certain state laws. Then there's the financial angle. The allocation of over $400,000 in fines, with most going to the board president. Espanol Network demands forensic accounting and immediate oversight. This is no longer poor governance. It's potential self-dealing and conflict of interest, both of which can carry criminal penalties in many jurisdictions. Finally, the public shift. The moment the community realized they were in T alone, highlights the importance of collective action and documentation. Once neighbors saw the pattern in the numbers, the board lost its cloak of authority. This is how abusive systems collapse. Not through one lawsuit, but through exposure, data, and courage. After the treasurer's resignation, a silence fell over the neighborhood. Not the kind that meant peace, but the kind that meant people were watching. The next board meeting was postponed due to scheduling conflicts. Then Trisha canceled the monthly newsletter. When residents asked for the budget breakdown, she claimed the files were temporarily inaccessible due to a system upgrade. That excuse might be worked. If a resident I contractor had confirmed there was no such upgrade. Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into meetings. Private, at first. In living rooms, in garages, in backyard decks, with citronella candles and folded lawn chairs. People were tired of living in fear of a notice in the mail, of being fined for dead grass when the community landscaping contract had been mysteriously delayed for over 6 months. Someone brought donuts. Someone else brought scanned violation logs they'd quietly photographed from the board's filing cabinet. What emerged was damning. Over 70% of all fines issued in the last 3 years had been concentrated on just 9 homes, all of them owned by residents who had either questioned Trisha's policies, spoken out at meetings, or refused to use her husband's overpriced approved repair company. The pattern wasn't coincident. It was targeted enforcement. I partnered with Miranda Torres to create an interactive timeline and data visualization, posted online under the headline, "Selective Enforcement, the Hidden Weapon of HOA Tyrants." The site got 47,000 hits in 48 hours. A law professor in Virginia cited it in a panel on property rights abuse. By now, our story had outgrown our valley, and Trisha knew it. Then came the anonymous leak. 2 flash drives mailed to Miranda's office. No return address. Inside, audio recordings of executive board meetings. The files weren't just damaging, they were explosive. "He's retired, but he's dangerous. People listen to judges. We need to hit him again." Something real, but technically legit. Paint color violation, mailbox, specs. Something from the covenants. If he sells and leaves, problem solved. The fine schedule can cover legal fees, he'll fold. That was Trisha's voice. Clear, unmistakable. I forwarded the files to the state attorney general's office. Then I played them at the next HOA meeting. The room went quiet. Trisha didn't attend. The vice president chaired the meeting, visibly shaken. Halfway through the agenda, he stood, removed his name badge, and left the building. 3 board members resigned by the end of the week. The others tried to salvage what they could. They issued a public apology filled with vague statements about misunderstandings and confusion during enforcement procedures. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. A petition for a special election to remove the board circulated. It needed 51% of homeowner signatures. We hit that number in 3 days. A new board was elected, not just new faces, but actual reformers, neighbors, parents, retirees, teachers, a librarian, no connections to Trisha, no private companies with HOA contracts. At the first meeting of the new board, I was invited to speak. I didn't come with demands. I came with questions. Would they cooperate with state investigators? Would they publish all financials and vendor contracts online? Would they suspend all fines and review the appeals process? Would they support legislation requiring HOA boards to undergo ethics and transparency training? The answers were yes, unanimously, but the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, because while the board had changed, the money was still missing. We still didn't know where the $400,000 had gone. We had paperwork, yes, but no invoices. No receipts, no accountability. That's when the IRS called. They had seen the article, they had seen the footage, and now they wanted the books. I handed over everything. So did Miranda. That same week, a neighbor knocked on my door with shaking hands and tears in her eyes. She had been on the HOAS Architectural Committee, a volunteer role. She showed me her resignation letter, and with it, 3 emails from Trisha over the past year. If this goes sideways, we say you are acting independently. Delete the draft proposal. We'll say it never reached a vote. It's your name on the letterhead, not mine. She'd been set up as the fall person. I asked her if she'd be willing to testify. She nodded. I thought we were helping the neighborhood, but we were just protecting her empire. What started as a fine about mailbox trim had become something much larger, a web of fraud, coercion, and cover-ups. It wasn't just about my case anymore. It was about justice for all the neighbors who'd been intimidated, silenced, or forced out. The FBI joined the investigation 2 weeks later, and for the first time in months, my porch lights stayed on all night. Not out of fear, but out of vigilance, because the tide had turned, and justice was finally knocking. What we just witnessed is the pivotal moment when an authoritarian HOA structure begins to collapse under the weight of its own secrecy. This is the anatomy of reform, and it starts with one crucial asset: evidence. Let's break it down. First, the pattern of selective enforcement. When an HOA disproportionately targets a small group of residents, especially those who criticize board decisions, that's not just unfair, it's potentially illegal. Courts have repeatedly ruled that uneven rule enforcement can constitute discriminatory practice, especially if it affects resale value, livelihood, or mental health. The leaked citation logs and financial breakdowns weren't just proof, they were ammunition. Second, the anonymous whistleblower leak changes the game entirely. Secret recordings of board members admitting to deliberate harassment and fine stacking strategies? That's no longer a civil infraction, that's criminal intent. In some states, those conversations could support charges ranging from official misconduct to conspiracy to commit fraud. Third, we see the psychological turning point, fear shifting into solidarity. Abusive HOA boards rely on fragmentation. They want neighbors isolated, silent, doubtful. But when those neighbors begin gathering, organizing, sharing information, the board loses its greatest weapon, invisibility. This case proves something vital. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Once the truth came out, board resignations followed, reforms were passed, and investigations deepened. And it all began with neighbors saying, enough. For any homeowner watching, document everything, build alliances, create paper trails. And when the moment is right, speak with a united voice. HOA abuse thrives in silence, but it ends when communities shine a light. It started with a knock. 2 agents in dark jackets showed up at the HOA office on a Tuesday morning. They didn't ask politely. They presented a federal warrant, walked past the receptionist, and began boxing up files. By noon, the office was sealed off with tape. A notice read, "Closed pending investigation." Word spread fast. Faster than wildfire, faster than gossip, faster than the fear that had kept so many quiet for so long. Neighbors came outside. They weren't whispering anymore. Did you hear? The IRS is in there? They're taking everything. It's finally happening. What unfolded over the next 72 hours was the kind of thing you only expect to see in movies, not in a quiet mountain valley with pastel houses and matching street lamps. By Wednesday evening, the first indictments were unsealed. Trisha Whitmore, president of the Pinecrest Valley HOA, was charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, obstruction of justice, abuse of fiduciary duty, and criminal conspiracy. She wasn't alone. 2 other board members were indicted. One had quietly moved out of state a month earlier, but federal agents tracked him to a condo in Arizona. He was arrested without incident. The third, the former treasurer who had resigned early on, turned herself in, along with a signed affidavit and a digital copy of secret financial spreadsheets. Trisha, she lawyered up. Hard, her attorney held a press conference on the courthouse steps, calling the charges politically motivated and an attack on homeowners' rights. But no one was buying it. Not anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. The financial documents showed over $410,000 in improper most of it funneled through contractors that didn't exist, including a landscaping firm registered to Trisha Escazet, who lived 2 states away in Hedon. T touched a Chevaline years. One emergency roof repair invoice billed the HOA $38,000 for a single home, and surveillance photos showed that house still had its original roof. But what truly turned the case wasn't the money, it was the emails. One line, buried in a thread Trisha thought she had deleted, would go on to be quoted in news articles, legal briefs, and a dozen advocacy documentaries. Once they're bankrupt or broken, they sell. We clean up the block. It was a smoking gun. By the following week, 60 Minutes had called. A national outlet ran a segment called HOAs Gone Rogue. Miranda Torres was interviewed live. Her investigative work now considered one of the most impactful community journalism in recent memory. And the ripple effects didn't stop at media. The Colorado Attorney General's office launched a statewide review of HOA oversight. They discovered that Pinecrest wasn't alone, that dozens of communities across the state had similar patterns of abuse, arbitrary fines, rigged elections, shady contractors, and bullied residents too scared to speak out. Meanwhile, I received subpoenas, testified before a grand jury. So did over 20 neighbors. Some were trembling, some were furious, some were relieved. One elderly couple brought handwritten notes and decades of records in manila folders. They'd kept everything. Fines for lawn decor, flags, door colors. It wasn't just harassment, it was targeted cultural suppression. One note scribbled in a retired school teacher's shaky hand read, "I told them I couldn't repaint the porch that week. My husband was in the ICU, they fined me anyway." That's what this was about. Not just money, but dignity. The right to grieve, to live, to resist arbitrary power in your own home. We held our own press conference the day after Trisha was denied bail. The new board stood behind me. Miranda to my left. Former HOA volunteers to my right. I spoke from the steps of the Old Town Library. This wasn't about bad governance. This was a criminal enterprise hiding behind homeowner association rules. It ends here, and it ends with us. Thunderous applause, not because I was a former judge, but because I was a neighbor, one who had fought and nearly lost, and now stood not as a victim, but as a survivor. The HOA insurance company, under pressure, offered a partial settlement to affected residents. It wasn't much, but it was something. Enough to help rebuild gardens, repaint doors, and pay back some of the fines that had driven people into debt. Lawsuits followed, civil suits, class actions, policy reform campaigns, but the most powerful change. Neighbors were talking again, smiling, waving from driveways. Kids played ball in the cul-de-sacs again. Windows opened. Truss, once poisoned, was slowly returning. And Trisha, she faced up to 35 years in federal prison. Her trial was set for the fall. We were ready, because in Pinecrest Valley, justice wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a name, it had a face, and it wasn't afraid to knock on any door, no matter how polished the doormat. This is the critical shift, where a dysfunctional HOA crosses the line from mismanagement into organized criminal behavior, and when that happens, the entire legal framework changes. Let's start with the charges. Wire fraud, mail fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. These aren't just regulatory violations. They're federal crimes. The moment Trisha and her board used interstate systems, emails, USPS, mailings, financial wire transfers, to further a fraudulent scheme, they placed themselves squarely in federal jurisdiction. This is why HOA corruption is so dangerous. Boards are often granted quasi-governmental authority, the power to fine, to lien, even to foreclose, yet they operate with almost no oversight. In many states, HOA boards aren't subject to the same transparency, ethics, or public record requirements that apply to city councils or school boards. That's how fraud festers. But what made this case different was the paper trail, the invoices to fake contractors, the internal emails, the community of whistleblowers who were organized, consistent, and legally savvy enough to present a timeline of abuse, not just scattered anecdotes. And then there's the quote, "Once they're bankrupt or broken, they sell." That's damning, not just legally, but socially. It's proof of intent to weaponize policy against vulnerable residents. That's the heart of the criminal enterprise. What followed: indictments, lawsuits, media attention reflects a growing trend. Public pressure forcing legal action in a space traditionally ignored by regulators. The lesson here: if your HOA is abusing power, don't just get mad. Get organized. Document everything, and never assume you're powerless. Sometimes, the system won't help, until you show them it's broken. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the steps before sunrise. Camera crews set up outside the doors. And residents, many who had once avoided public confrontation, now arrived with signs that read, "No one is above the law. HOA abuse equals criminal abuse. We are Pinecrest Valley." The trial of Trisha Whitmore began on a rainy Monday in October, nearly 18 months after the first allegations surfaced. Inside, the federal courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Observers stood along the back wall, silent, watching. Trisha entered flanked by her legal team, dressed immaculately in gray with a thin smile that barely masked the tension behind her eyes. The confident, domineering woman who once ruled Pinecrest Valley like a private kingdom now faced 13 felony counts. The prosecution opened strong. They laid out a timeline of corruption, false contractor payouts, forged signatures on ballots, secret board meetings, violating HOA bylaws, retaliatory fines issued to dissent, and most damning of all proof that Trisha personally profited from the fund transfers. They presented internal board emails where Trisha discussed residents like pieces on a chessboard. She referred to one elderly couple as low-hanging fruit, implying they could be bullied into moving. The courtroom murmured when that line was read aloud. Residents who had once feared retaliation now sat in the front rows, holding hands, listening, heads high. Then came the witnesses. I testified on the second day. Under oath, I described the bogus fines, the threats I received, the fire that destroyed my home. I spoke of neighbors too frightened to speak out, of the elderly woman who cried in my kitchen after being fined for wind chimes. The defense attempted to discredit me. They questioned my objectivity. As a former federal judge, they tried to paint me as a man with a grudge. But the jury didn't flinch. Neither did Miranda Torres, who testified the following day. Her reporting had been foundational to the investigation, and she brought video footage of secret board meetings, contractor invoices cross-referenced with bank statements, and interviews with residents who had nothing left to lose. Trisha's defense relied on three strategies: blame the treasurer, claim ignorance of accounting practices, frame everything as strict enforcement of rules. But her former allies on the board had already flipped. One testified that Trisha ordered them to increase fines on problem households. Another admitted to shredding documents on her orders. The most damning moment came during the cross-examination of a forensic accountant. The prosecution asked, "Can you trace the funds from HOA accounts to any personal use by the defendant?" The expert answered, "Yes, multiple times, including transfers to a private brokerage account belonging to Ms. Whitmore, used to purchase out-of-state property and luxury items." The defense tried to object. Overruled. The jury saw everything: photos of the beach condo, records of the spa retreats, credit card receipts for designer handbags purchased on HOA, debit cards. It took only 5 days for the prosecution to present their full case. The defense rested with barely a whimper, and when the judge gave the final instructions to the jury, the silence in the room was suffocating. Deliberations lasted just 9 hours. The verdict: guilty on all 13 counts. Gasps, applause, tears, not from joy, but from release. The weight that had crushed this neighborhood was finally lifted. Trisha didn't look at the jury as the verdict was read. She stared straight ahead, hands folded, as if willing herself to vanish. Her sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. The maximum combined sentence, 35 years in federal prison. But justice didn't stop at Trisha. The fallout rippled outward. The HOAS insurance carrier canceled its policy. Citing material misrepresentation, civil suits were filed against the HOA itself. State lawmakers announced a task force to investigate HOA abuses. Statewide national media named Pinecrest Valley ground zero for HOA reform. And within our neighborhood, something changed. The people who used to hide behind curtains now hosted porch barbecues. Residents walked their dogs with confidence. New welcome signs went up at the neighborhood entrance. Not just decorative, but meaningful. They read, "Pinecrest Valley, reclaimed by justice." I returned home every night, exhausted, but lighter. I watched children ride bikes in the same cul-de-sacs where, just months earlier, people had been fined for sidewalk chalk. In a strange way, the courtroom had become our town square, a place where secrets were finally voiced, where silence was replaced with strength. And as Trisha awaited sentencing, she stayed in federal custody. No more press conferences, no more controlling ballots, just another defendant waiting for her day of reckoning. For Pinecrest Valley, the ERA of fear was over. The era of rebuilding and remembrance had just begun. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a national referendum on unchecked HOA authority. Let's talk about why this trial mattered. First, the legal precedent. Trisha Whitmore being found guilty on 13 federal counts. Wire fraud, obstruction, conspiracy sends a chilling message to corrupt HOA boards nationwide. For too long, these entities operated in the gray zone between civil violation and criminal enterprise. This case pushes that boundary firmly into the criminal realm. Why is that significant? Because until now, HOA misconduct was often dismissed as neighborly disputes. But when residents are being systematically targeted, fined into foreclosure, or retaliated against through fraudulent rule enforcement, that's not a dispute, that's extortion under color of authority. Second, the power of forensic accounting. The prosecution didn't just rely on angry testimony. They presented irrefutable digital trails, fund transfers, emails, credit card logs. HOA boards rarely expect this level of scrutiny. But once financial fraud touches federal systems, banks, postal services, digital records, it becomes much harder to hide. Third, the emotional impact. This community watched their tormentor face judgment in the most public way possible, and that changes people. Fear is replaced by empowerment. Victims become witnesses. Silence becomes testimony. Finally, the ripple effect. Lawmakers, insurers, media, and homeowners are watching. And for once, they're asking, who polices the HOA police? This trial may be the beginning of the answer. If you're living under an abusive HOA regime, take notes. This is how a paper trail becomes a prison sentence. This is how communities win. The courtroom was full again, but this time, it was quieter. There were no reporters yelling questions, no dramatic confrontations, just a long line of neighbors filing into the same federal courthouse where they had once feared they'd never be heard. It was sentencing day for Trisha. Weeks had passed since the verdict. In that time, our community had started to process the weight of what had happened. Some residents were still raw with emotion, others were finally beginning to breathe again. But everyone wanted closure. I arrived early, taking the same seat I'd occupied throughout the trial. Next to me sat Eleanor and Mark, two retirees who had faced foreclosure over $75 in alleged grass overgrowth fines. Behind me, a row of young couples, many of whom had quietly considered selling their homes before the arrest. Now, they were staying. The prosecutor spoke first. He recapped the crimes. 13 felony counts, years of calculated fraud, and a pattern of retaliation that had endangered property, mental health, and even lives. Then came the victim impact statements. Eleanor took the stand and said, her voice steady but full of emotion, "This woman made us feel like criminals for decorating for Christmas. I spent Christmas Eve crying because I thought I'd lose my house. That's not just a fine. That's terror." Another resident described being fined for their autistic child's therapy swing, which the HOA had labeled an unauthorized structure. That swing had been removed under threat of daily penalties. Now, the mother stood before the judge, clutching a photo of her son, and said, "She used the rule book like a weapon." Then it was my turn. I looked directly at Trisha. For the first time, she looked back, not defiantly, but blankly, like someone no longer steering their own ship. I said, "Your sentence today will not erase the fear you caused, the homes you took, or the trust you broke, but it will tell every HOA tyrant watching this case that their day of reckoning can come too." The defense argued for leniency. They cited Trisha's age, her charitable contributions over the years, and claimed she was remorseful. Her attorney read a brief statement in which she said, "I let the power of my position cloud my judgment. I regret the pain I caused, but there were no tears, no apology to the victims by name, and certainly no return of the stolen funds, most of which were never recovered." Then the judge delivered the sentence. "Trisha Whitmore, you used your authority not to serve, but to exploit. You targeted your neighbors, manipulated the rules, and treated community governance like a private enterprise. This court finds no basis for leniency." He sentenced her to 27 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the guideline structure given her age and the scope of her crimes. Gasps, quiet sobs, but above all, relief. It was over. As U.S. Marshals led her away, she didn't look back. That afternoon, we walked out of the courthouse and into the sunlight as a community, no longer just the victims of a power-hungry board president, but the authors of our own victory. And that's when something shifted. The courthouse steps became the setting for something no one expected, a spontaneous town hall. Neighbors hugged. Journalists asked respectful questions. A few children held handmade signs that read, "Hope wins, goodbye, Trisha." And for the first time, the word HOA wasn't just associated with fines and fear, but with resistance, justice, and rebirth. Over the next few weeks, we organized healing sessions in the community center. Trauma counselors volunteered time. Local clergy and therapists held group sessions for those who had suffered the most, financially, emotionally, physically. A temporary board was appointed with oversight from state mediators. New elections would be held, this time openly, with mail-in ballots and public tallies. No more secret proxies, no more locked-door decisions. We reviewed every HOA bylaw, line by line. Red ink marked where fines had been abused. Blue ink highlighted what needed clarification. Residents finally had a say in the rules they'd live by. Miranda Torres published a follow-up report that was syndicated nationally. Talk shows, podcasts, and investigative outlets picked up the story. The public wanted to know, how did one woman terrorize an entire neighborhood for so long? And more importantly, how did the neighborhood fight back and win? Legislators took note. Activists formed HOA reform coalitions. Residents across the country began reaching out, sharing stories, some eerily similar to ours. But in Pinecrest Valley, what mattered most was the silence that returned. The good kind. No more daily notices, no more threats on windshields, no more sudden, unexplained violations. Just neighbors, just homes, just the quiet dignity of peace restored. And on that first quiet Sunday after sentencing, I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee. I could hear kids laughing down the block. Birds returned to the pine trees. And I thought, this is what we were fighting for all along. When Trisha Whitmore received 27 years in federal prison, the courtroom didn't just erupt in closure, it set a national precedent. Let's break down why this moment matters. First, federal sentencing for HOA corruption is rare. Most cases involving HOA abuse stall in civil court. Endless litigation, private settlements, and no admission of guilt. But this was a full-blown criminal conviction with teeth. Wire fraud, conspiracy, retaliation through governance. It signaled that homeowner associations, often brushed off as local nuisances, can absolutely cross into prosecutable crime, and that signal matters. For judges, this case gives a roadmap. For prosecutors, it sets a charging precedent. For victims and other communities, it gives hope that someone will finally take them seriously. Second, there's emotional justice here. The victims weren't just awarded damages, they were given a stage. The victim impact statements weren't courtroom theatrics. They were social proof of systemic harm. From Christmas decorations to autism swings, the abuse wasn't petty, it was deeply personal. That visibility changes public perception. Third, the sentencing sparked an organic civic revival. The community didn't just walk out of that courthouse. They organized healing circles, rule reform, public elections. It proves something crucial. Once fear is lifted, self-governance thrives. So, here's the lesson for every resident feeling powerless under an HOA: organize others, push for outside review, and if you're ignored, don't stop, go bigger. Because as Pinecrest Valley proved, the law can catch up, even if it takes a village to lead it there. The day after Trisha Whitmore's sentencing, I walked to the edge of my property. The charred remains of what once was my home still standing like a blackened skeleton against the Pine Ridge sky. For weeks I'd been consumed by the trial, the testimonies, and the battle for justice. But now came the hard part, starting over. Not just rebuilding a structure, but redefining a community. What surprised me first wasn't the insurance adjusters or the permits. It was the people. Over 60 neighbors showed up that first weekend, tools in hand. Some brought wood, others brought food, many brought stories. Stories they'd been too afraid to tell until now. We cleared debris together, tore down what couldn't be saved, marked what could. By week 3, a new house frame was rising, but this time it wasn't just a house. It was a vision, a shared space. My new home would include a community meeting room, open to all, with a lending library, foldable seating for town halls, and a memorial plaque honoring victims of HOA retaliation. It became a symbol, not just of personal resilience, but collective triumph. We changed more than blueprints. Architects donated time. Fireproofing experts improved ventilation. An environmental nonprofit helped us install solar panels, not only to reduce energy costs, but to stand for self-sufficiency, something we were denied for years under Trisha's reign. News crews returned, this time not for scandal, but for celebration. Judge rebuilds with purpose. Read one headline. HOA abuse sparks sustainability movement. Read another. But the biggest story was what happened around the neighborhood. Other families followed suit. Fence lines came down. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years, divided by past HOA fines and whispered threats, began planning together. We transformed a vacant lot, once reserved for Trisha's future clubhouse, into a community garden. Children helped plant vegetables. Elderly residents, many still shaken from years of isolation, took charge of watering and harvest. We voted to form a solar co-op, pooling our money to bring panels to every home in the valley. It wasn't about green energy alone. It was about independence. Meanwhile, Eleanor, the same woman who once feared she'd lose her house over Christmas decorations, organized a monthly potluck. Every gathering started with a moment of gratitude, not for what we'd gained, but for what we'd regained: freedom, voice, peace. And yet, we also knew that community healing couldn't exist without accountability. We started a fund with the $400,000 recovered from Trisha's frozen asset. Thanks to a matching donor campaign, that fund became the Pinecrest Valley Educational Foundation, offering scholarships for students entering public service, law, or journalism. Every dollar stolen was now funding the next generation of watchdogs and whistleblowers. The first recipient, a young woman named Haley, whose parents had once faced foreclosure. She wanted to study investigative journalism. Miranda Torres, now nationally known for her HOA series, personally mentored her. Yes, Miranda and I grew close during the investigation. We bonded over late-night calls, cold coffee, and the relentless weight of the truth. But even after the story ended, we kept meeting. Coffee turned into dinner. Work turned into companionship. The day we opened the community library, Miranda brought me a gift, a pen with the words, "You made justice livable." She didn't know then that I'd started writing a book. I titled it, "When Good Neighbors Go Bad," a federal judge's story. The manuscript poured out of me, not just facts, but feelings. I detailed every manipulation, every resistance tactic, every law we thought would protect us that didn't, and most importantly, I documented how we fought back, and won. Publishers lined up. The book became a bestseller. Book tours followed. Law schools invited me to speak. Community groups asked for guidance. My mailbox flooded with letters from homeowners across the country, many just beginning their own battles. But I always told them, you don't need to be a judge, you just need to be awake. And together, at home, our community finally felt like a community again. Children played freely. Neighbors shared power tools instead of anonymous complaints. The HOA board was now transparent, democratic, and fully audited. And every year, on the anniversary of the sentencing, we held a justice dinner, a fundraiser. Yes, but also a reunion. A place to remember not only what we survived, but how we transformed. The greatest irony: property values in Pinecrest Valley went up. Buyers were drawn not to the uniform lawns or strict codes, but to the story, a neighborhood that fought for its soul and won. And so, each time I step onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee and watch the sun rise over that quiet valley, I remember the fire, the fear, the fight. But more than anything, I remember the people, the ones who stayed, who rebuilt, who turned corruption into community. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't prison or profit, it's peace. Rebuilding after an HOA collapse isn't just about repairing homes. It's about redefining the very idea of community governance. What we saw in Pinecrest Valley wasn't just construction, it was restoration of agency. Let's unpack what made this stage of the story so powerful. First, the intentional design of the new home matters. By including a public meeting space and a lending library, the former judge didn't just reclaim his personal property. He turned his home into a civic anchor. These kinds of shared-use spaces radically change neighborhood dynamics. They promote transparency, prevent isolation, and send a clear message: this community belongs to everyone. Second, the symbolism of sustainability was brilliant. Solar panels, community gardens, rainwater harvesting. These weren't just eco-friendly gestures. They were statements of independence. Under abusive HOA regimes, even your energy choices can be restricted. Pinecrest Valley flipped that narrative by investing in resilience, cost-sharing, and local control. And third, perhaps most importantly, the transformative use of recovered funds. Too often, restitution money disappears into legal fees or bureaucracy. Here, it became the Pinecrest Valley Educational Foundation, funding future watchdogs, advocates, and civic-minded professionals. That's how you turn trauma into long-term impact. The shift from fear to fellowship, from lawsuits to libraries, shows what's possible when accountability is paired with vision. Not only was justice served, but hope was institutionalized. This is a model any HOA-strained community can study. Not just how to fight, but how to rebuild better, with purpose, participation, and pride. I never expected the fallout from a $75 trash bin fine to reach the steps of Congress. But then again, I never expected my house to burn down, or a neighborhood to rise up, or for a Pulitzer-winning journalist to ask me for a second cup of coffee at the end of an interview. The morning after our first justice dinner, I received an email marked urgent from a congressional aide. They were drafting new federal oversight legislation for homeowners associations. They wanted my story, not just the legal details, but the human cost. A month later, I was standing in front of the House Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development, telling members of Congress what it was like to be wiretapped and nearly killed, all under the protection of a nonprofit corporate structure that was supposed to enhance property values. I told them how the HOA board, under Trisha Whitmore, operated like a shadow government with unchecked power, how our neighborhood lived under rule by fear, not consensus, how our existing state laws were too weak, too vague, too deferential to these so-called mini-governments. And I wasn't alone. Dozens of others came forward. Victims from Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, stories eerily similar to ours: illegal fines, retaliatory liens, board fraud, intimidation, even abuse of elderly residents. And every story was made possible by the same thing: lack of oversight. That testimony helped launch the federal HOA Accountability Initiative, a joint task force between the FTC HUD and state attorneys general. Their first move, a multi-state investigation into financial misconduct within large property management firms. But the bigger changes came closer to home. Colorado passed the Homeowner Protection and Transparency Act of 2024, the strongest HOA reform bill in the country. Among its key features, mandatory annual financial disclosures, background checks for all board candidates, limits on fines and foreclosures, independent ombudsman offices for homeowner grievances. HOAs were now treated less like casual volunteer clubs and more like governance bodies, with real accountability. Soon, other states followed. California, Illinois, Oregon, and New York introduced their own HOA reform packages. Advocacy groups sprang up nationwide, some of them even naming themselves after Pinecrest. But the most profound shift wasn't legal. It was cultural. People started talking. Before our story, HOA abuse was something whispered between neighbors or buried in complaint forums. Now, it was covered on national news. It became the subject of investigative documentaries, podcasts, and academic research. Universities created clinics to help low-income homeowners navigate HOA law. I was asked to deliver keynote speeches at 4 different law schools. Not as a retired judge, but as a survivor of systemic failure. Students lined up afterward, asking how they could help, where to start. I always gave them the same advice: don't aim to be heroes, aim to be honest. One of those students later emailed me after graduating. She was taking on her first HOA abuse case in Louisiana. She said my book helped her client keep their home. That book, When Good Neighbors Go Bad, remained on the nonfiction bestseller list for months. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar to too many readers. Victims saw their own stories in its pages, and then came the letters. Thousands of them, from all over the country. Some from people who just needed someone to believe them. Others from homeowners in the middle of battles, sending pictures of liens, court summons, angry board emails. I tried to reply to every one, and it wasn't just the victims who wrote. Former HOA board members, some of them previously complicit, admitted they operated in ignorance or fear. One man from Nevada confessed that he'd once fined a woman for planting tomatoes in her front yard, because it was just what they always did. After reading the book, he resigned, helped rewrite the bylaws, and started a neighborhood discussion group. That's the part they don't teach you in law school. Guilt can heal, too, when it's channeled into change. Meanwhile, Miranda Torres's reporting career soared. After her HOACorruption series won the Palazza, she was offered anchor positions, think tank fellowships, and guest spots on major networks. But she turned most of it down. Instead, she started a nonprofit newsroom focused exclusively on investigating abuse of private power. Corporate landlords, property managers, arbitration firms, she called it Civic Wire. I joined the board. Miranda and I traveled to different cities, attending town halls, meeting with homeowners, pushing for legislative updates. Our lives, once forced together by fire and injustice, were now united by something deeper, purpose. And back in Pinecrest, things only got better. With each year, the fear faded and pride took its place. Our annual Justice Dinner became a state-level event, with speakers from all over the country. Our scholarships expanded. Our solar co-op was now producing surplus energy for nearby towns. But the ripple didn't stop with us. Other communities replicated our model: community lending libraries, rotating meeting spaces, transparent budgets, restorative governance. Instead of HOAs ruling over neighbors, they now served them, as they were supposed to. One reporter called it the Pinecrest Doctrine, the idea that communities thrive not when controlled, but when empowered. And through it all, I kept reminding people, we didn't win because we were special. We won because we refused to be silent. The transformation we just heard isn't just inspiring. It's a case study in how localized injustice can spark systemic reform. Let's break down the impact through a governance and legal lens. First, testimony becomes policy. The Pinecrest case shows the power of individual narratives in shaping national oversight. When a federal judge gives first-hand testimony about wiretaps, harassment, and the misuse of nonprofit structures, it reframes HOAs, not as private neighborhood disputes, but as quasi-governments wielding real coercive power, often without checks. This narrative helped fuel Colorado's landmark legislation, which went beyond mere procedural tweaks. Background checks, financial transparency mandates, and state ombudsman offices represent a structural shift in how HOA governance is viewed, not casual, but constitutional in its implications. Second, the ripple effect across states. Policy adoption is often regional. Once one state pioneers effective oversight, others follow. In HOA governance, this leads to greater standardization and legal clarity, exactly what homeowners across America have been demanding for decades. Third, the cultural awakening. The rise of Civic Wire, law school engagement, and public forums marks a long overdue shift in how HOA power is understood by future legal professionals and journalists. Abuse thrives in silence. Pinecrest broke that silence and normalized speaking up, and perhaps most powerfully, the redemption arc of former board members. This reminds us that not all HOA abuses stem from malice. Many come from ignorance, precedent, or fear. Reform includes education, not just punishment. Pinecrest proved one thing: justice is contagious. When you hold power accountable, others don't just notice, they follow. The first time I laid eyes on Trisha Whitmore in federal court, she looked nothing like the iron-fisted tyrant who had once ruled Pinecrest Valley. She was pale, quiet, dressed in a modest gray suit. No gold jewelry, no designer bag, no sunglasses inside the courtroom. But make no mistake, behind the meek expression was the same calculating mind that had masterminded a years-long reign of terror through manipulation, exploitation, and intimidation. Her trial began on a Monday morning under heavy media attention. National outlets camped outside the courthouse. HOA reform activists held signs reading, "No one is above the rules. They write in board power does not equal absolute power." The courtroom was packed, not just with journalists but with former neighbors, elderly victims, and even former HOA board members now testifying against her. The charges were extensive: mail and wire fraud, racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit arson, money laundering, witness intimidation. And it wasn't just Trisha on trial. 3 former board members, the HOAS contracted attorney, and 2 executives from the affiliated property management firm were also named as The prosecution's opening argument was damning. This wasn't about enforcing bylaws. This was about enriching and protecting a small group of insiders who treated a neighborhood as their personal empire. Until the people pushed back, Miranda Torres' reporting had uncovered much of the paper trail that prosecutors used. Everything from inflated invoices to deleted emails and backdated violation letters. One of the most shocking revelations was that the HOA had been double charging residents for community improvement projects that never existed, and funneling those payments through shell vendors tied to Trisha's cousins. I testified on the 3rd day. It wasn't easy. Reliving the fire, the threats, the isolation, it took more emotional energy than I expected, but I looked directly at Trisha as I described what she did to our neighbors. The way she humiliated retirees over landscaping violations, fined young couples for toys left in driveways, and falsified meeting minutes to silence dissent. And I reminded the court that we were only in that room because neighbors refused to be afraid anymore. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from a former board treasurer who turned state witness in exchange for immunity. He confessed that Trisha had pressured him to manipulate HOA records, overcharge specific residents, and lose complaint letters from those she labeled troublemakers. He described secret meetings, burner phones, and even a code system for fines, all designed to avoid scrutiny from state regulators. By the time the defense tried to paint Trisha as misunderstood and overwhelmed, the damage was done. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty? On all major counts. The courtroom gasped. Trisha showed no emotion. Her attorney requested immediate appeal. The judge denied bail, citing the risk of flight and further obstruction. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. Trisha Whitmore received 37 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 20. Her co-defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 22 years, depending on their level of involvement. The court also approved asset forfeiture, properties, bank accounts, and even pensions to help reimburse victims. The case set precedent. It became the first federal racketeering conviction tied to HOA corruption in U.S. history. Law schools added it to their case. Advocacy groups hailed it as a turning point in the battle against privatized power without accountability. But something deeper changed that day. For the first time, HOA boards across the country understood that there were limits, that nonprofit status didn't mean untouchable, that homeowners weren't powerless, that federal courts could and would intervene when criminal abuse masqueraded as community governance. Back in Pinecrest, we gathered in the rebuilt community space to watch the verdict announcement replayed on the news. Some people cried, others cheered, a few just sat quietly, finally able to breathe. That evening, a retired nurse who once received 17 fines in a single month for decorative clutter brought out a bottle of champagne she'd been saving for when this was all over. We passed paper cups around the room, raised a toast, and promised we'd never let it happen again. Later that night, I stood outside on my deck. The sky was quiet. No patrols, just wind in the trees and the hum of the solar array. I thought about justice, what it means, what it costs, and how it never comes from a single verdict, but from a community unwilling to surrender to silence. The trial ended, but our movement had only just begun. What happened in that federal courtroom didn't just bring one corrupt HOA president to justice. It redefined the limits of community power in America. Let's examine what made this trial historic and why it matters so profoundly for every neighborhood in the country. First, the RICO application. Homeowners associations operate as nonprofit corporations, which traditionally fall outside the scope of criminal racketeering laws. But this case proved that when those corporations are used as criminal enterprises for fraud, embezzlement, and systemic abuse, they're not just civil matters, they're federal cases. That changes everything. This opens the door for national oversight. Regulators now recognize that HOA boards, when unchecked, can wield government-like authority without due process, transparency, or accountability. In essence, private governments. And now, thanks to this case, subject to public justice. Second, the legal precedent. Trisha Whitmore's conviction marks the first federal racketeering sentence tied to HOA abuse. That gives lawyers and prosecutors a legal framework they've never had before, something they can use to protect thousands of communities currently suffering in silence. Third, the cultural shift. The speed of the jury's verdict. That tells us something. This wasn't a gray area case. It was clear to average citizens that HOA power had been weaponized. That clarity will fuel future jury trials, community actions, and legislation across the country. This wasn't just a legal win. It was a blueprint for how to fight back, how to win, and how to make sure the next Trisha Whitmore never rises again. The trial was over, but the work had just begun. In the months that followed the sentencing, something remarkable happened. The same neighborhood that had once lived under surveillance and fear became a national symbol of resilience, transformation, and leadership. We didn't just celebrate the convictions. We organized dozens of former victims, including those who had never even spoken publicly during Trisha's reign, came forward with their own stories and ideas. Some wanted to address housing equity. Others pushed for sustainable infrastructure. A few simply asked how they could help clean up the community park. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to speak up. The newly formed Pinecrest Valley Civic Association replaced the disgraced HOA. Elections were held publicly, ballots were paper-based, verified by third parties, and tallied live in community meetings. Board members now served fixed, non-renewable terms. All finances were posted monthly, online and on bulletin boards in every neighborhood block. But our most powerful change wasn't on paper, it was in culture. Where fear once ruled, purpose filled the vacuum. We launched a mentorship program, pairing retired professionals with local youth. A community technology lab now sits where the old HOA compliance office used to operate, outfitted with laptops, printers, and fiber optic internet. Funded by a state grant, we applied for it together. We even started a neighborhood podcast called Pinecrest Rewired. That covers civic engagement, environmental initiatives, and yes, HOA horror stories from around the country. The garden where Trisha once banned vegetables now thrives as a public comment. A local artist painted a mural across the old retaining wall. It reads, "We took back our neighborhood and gave it to each other." Perhaps the most emotional moment came at our first annual Pinecrest Justice Dinner, an event held to honor those who stood up, spoke out, and stood with one another. Neighbors who once hid behind curtains now stood shoulder to shoulder, wearing ribbons to remember what we'd endured and what we'd changed. Miranda Torres gave the keynote speech. She talked not about journalism, but about courage, about how truth-telling is communal, about the power of whistleblowers and watchdogs, and about how stories, our stories, shape public policy more effectively than white papers or legal briefs ever could. Later that night, she and I danced together in the same community room where years earlier we had once whispered about subpoenas, hidden mix, and escape plans. Now, it was just music and laughter and the future. Our story didn't end with a conviction. It became the origin of a national movement. Within a year, 12 other neighborhoods across 6 states cited the Pinecrest case in their lawsuits against abusive HOA boards. The Department of Justice launched a task force to investigate patterns of misuse in private housing associations. Congress passed the Homeowner Protection and Transparency Act, requiring annual federal audits for any HOA exceeding a certain size or income level. And still, letters pour in. Some are heartbreaking, stories of elderly residents evicted for weeds. Others are hopeful, new boards starting fresh, armed with better knowledge and stronger ethics. I reply to as many as I can. Sometimes I refer them to legal resources. Other times, I just let them know they're not alone. That's really what this all comes down to. We didn't win because we had money or power. We won because we stopped waiting for someone else to save us. We became the people who fought back, and then reached out to help others do the same. Pinecrest is no longer the neighborhood that burned down. It's the neighborhood that rose up. I sit here today on my porch, the one we rebuilt with community, labor, and love, watching the sun break through the clouds that so often hang over our little mountain valley. It paints everything in a golden light. The solar panels gleam. Kids ride past on bikes. A potluck flyer flutters on the message board across the street. And I remember the words I said in court that day. Words I carry still. Justice is not just about punishment. It's about possibility. It's about who we become after the fire. We became a family. We became a movement. We became free. This final chapter isn't just closure. It's a blueprint. Pinecrest Valley didn't just recover from authoritarian HOA rule. It reinvented the very idea of what neighborhood governance can be. That transformation holds crucial lessons for homeowners, community leaders, and policymakers nationwide. First, accountability is contagious. Once transparency and justice were enforced, participation soared. You'll notice how the very people once silenced became civic leaders. That's the hallmark of a healthy HOA. Not compliance through fear, but contribution through trust. Second, structural reforms must be paired with cultural renewal. You can mandate financial reports and voting procedures, but the real change came when Pinecrest replaced paranoia with purpose. Mentorship programs, tech labs, gardens. These weren't luxuries. They were restorative justice tools that rewove the social fabric. Third, a new standard for oversight. The Homeowner Protection and Transparency Act, inspired by this case, signals a nationwide shift. No longer are HOAs viewed as untouchable few. They're now seen, rightly, as organizations that demand the same scrutiny and integrity as public agencies, because their impact is just as real. Finally, the importance of story. This case wasn't won in courtrooms alone. It was won in conversations, newsrooms, neighborhood gatherings. Sharing stories isn't just cathartic. It's strategic. It breaks silence, educates the public, and builds movements. Pinecrest's journey proves a vital truth. HOA reform isn't just about stopping corruption. It español despaño, and showing the nation what is possible when ordinary people demand extraordinary change. If Pinecrest can do it, So can your neighborhood. We began this story with a $75 fine. That's all it took, one piece of paper on one doorstep to begin unraveling a regime of corruption, intimidation, and control. But we didn't tell this story just to relive trauma. We told it to remind you of something bigger. That what happened in Pinecrest Valley can happen anywhere. When the wrong people get power with no oversight, it only takes time before abuse follows. But when the right people find the courage to speak, organize, and fight back, justice can win. Over the last 90 minutes, we saw how that courage spread. From a retired federal judge standing alone, 2 neighbors secretly passing information through code words and burner phones, 2 journalists risking their careers, 2 prosecutors willing to treat HOA crime as the serious offense it is. The result: an entire community reborn, a national conversation sparked, and a roadmap laid out for every neighborhood trapped under the thumb of bad governance. Let's be honest, HOAs aren't inherently evil. At their best, they maintain order, protect property values, and provide shared resources. But without transparency, they can become private governments without accountability. And when that happens, it's no longer about lawn heights or mailbox colors. It's about power and who controls your life behind closed doors. Here's what Pinecrest Valley proved. You don't need to be wealthy to fight corruption. You need to be relentless. You don't need permission to organize. You need each other. And when good people stand together, even the strongest tyrant can fall. This isn't the end of the story. It's a warning and an invitation. If you are rewatching this and living under an HOA that feels more like a dictatorship than a community, know this: you are not alone. There are legal tools. There are allies. There are millions of others just like you. And the first step is telling your story. Drop your HOA horror story in the comments. Subscribe to Karen Stories for more cases like this one. True, researched, and told with purpose. Share this video with your neighbors, your family, your attorney. Let it be the match that lights the fire of change where you live. Because sometimes justice begins not with a courtroom, but with a conversation. And sometimes it starts with you. I'm Judge Ronald Mapp, and this was my story. But it doesn't have to end here, because the next story might be yours. Fade out with soft music, on-screen text. When Good Neighbors Go Bad, a federal judge's story, available now in audiobook and print. For legal resources or to report HOA abuse, visit HOACorruption.org. Subscribe, comment, share, because your rights matter, and so does your voice.